Close your eyes for a moment. Now, imagine you're standing in your childhood bedroom. Can you see the colors of the walls? Feel the texture of the bedspread beneath your fingertips? Smell that distinct scent that made it uniquely yours? Open your eyes again. Where exactly did those sensations come from just now? Your bedroom might be thousands of miles away, or perhaps it no longer exists at all, yet your brain just constructed a vivid, multi-sensory experience from nothing but memory and imagination. This simple exercise reveals something profound and unsettling about the nature of human perception. The very thing we rely on most to navigate our world, our senses, might not be the reliable witnesses to reality we believe them to be. Every moment of every day, you're living inside a constructed reality, a sophisticated simulation created by 3 pounds of neural tissue sitting inside your skull. The question that has puzzled philosophers for millennia and neuroscientists for decades is this: if our brains are constantly creating our reality, how can we ever know what's truly real? This isn't just an abstract philosophical puzzle. It's a question that cuts to the very heart of human existence, with implications that ripple through everything from criminal justice to mental health, from artificial intelligence to the nature of consciousness itself. Are you seeing the world as it actually is, or are you trapped inside an elaborate illusion, trusting senses that might be fundamentally unreliable? To understand just how strange and wonderful and potentially deceptive our senses really are, we need to embark on a journey through the hidden landscapes of perception, where nothing is quite as it seems, and where the boundary between reality and illusion becomes increasingly blurred. Let's start with what should be the most straightforward sense of all: vision. Right now, as you read these words, photons are bouncing off this screen and into your eyes, creating what feels like a direct, unmediated experience of text and meaning. But here's the first surprise: you're not actually seeing most of what you think you're seeing. In the center of your retina sits a small region called the fovea, about the size of your thumbnail held at arm's length. This tiny area contains the highest concentration of photoreceptor cells and provides the sharp, detailed vision you experience when you focus on something directly. Everything else, the vast majority of your visual field, is processed by your peripheral vision, which has much lower resolution and is actually quite poor at detecting fine details, colors, and even movement in many situations. Yet right now, you feel like you can see everything in your field of vision with perfect clarity. This is your brain's first magic trick. It's constantly moving your eyes in tiny movements called saccades, about 3 times per second, rapidly sampling different parts of your visual environment and then stitching together a coherent, high-resolution image from these fragmented snapshots. Your brain fills in the gaps with predictions, assumptions, and educated guesses based on previous experience. In essence, you're seeing a carefully constructed movie, edited in real time by your visual cortex, rather than a live feed of reality. But the deception goes much deeper than this. Consider the blind spot that exists in each of your eyes, a region about the size of 6 full moons where your optic nerve connects to your retina, creating an area with no photoreceptors at all. You're completely blind in this region, yet you never notice it. Your brain seamlessly fills in the missing information, painting over the blind spot with details borrowed from the surrounding area. It's such a convincing illusion that the blind spot was only discovered in the 17th century by French physicist Edmé Mariotte, and even then, it was considered so surprising that it became a popular party trick at the court of King Louis XIV. This kind of sensory sleight of hand isn't limited to vision. Your brain is constantly performing similar tricks with all of your senses, creating a seamless experience of reality from fragmentary, incomplete, and often contradictory information. The more neuroscientists study perception, the more they realize that what we call reality is actually a sophisticated virtual reality system, one so advanced and convincing that we mistake it for the real world itself. The story of how we discovered this began not with neuroscientists, but with philosophers who wondered whether our senses could ever give us true knowledge about the world. Ancient Greek philosophers like Plato suggested that our sensory experiences were like shadows on a cave wall, mere approximations of a deeper reality that we could never directly access. Plato's famous allegory of the cave described prisoners chained in a cave, forced to watch shadows projected on the wall, mistaking these flickerings for reality itself. Only through reason and philosophy, Plato argued, could we hope to glimpse the true forms that cast these shadows. This skepticism about the reliability of the senses continued through the ages. In the 17th century, René Descartes famously questioned everything he could possibly doubt, including the testimony of his senses. He imagined an evil demon that could deceive him about everything he thought he perceived, creating false sensory experiences indistinguishable from real ones. While Descartes ultimately concluded that he could trust his existence as a thinking being, I think, therefore I am, he remained deeply suspicious of sensory experience as a path to certain knowledge. But it wasn't until the rise of experimental psychology and neuroscience in the 19th and 20th centuries that we began to understand just how prescient these philosophical concerns were. Scientists started to discover that perception wasn't a passive recording of sensory information, but an active, constructive process that could be studied, measured, and, most revealingly, fooled. One of the most important early insights came from Hermann von Helmholtz, a 19th century German physician and physicist who proposed that perception involved unconscious inference. According to Helmholtz, your brain doesn't simply receive sensory data, it actively interprets that data based on prior knowledge and assumptions about the world. When you see a friend approaching from a distance, you don't perceive them as growing larger as they walk toward you, even though the image on your retina is indeed getting bigger. Your brain automatically compensates for distance, maintaining the perception of a constant-sized person moving through space. Helmholtz's insights were revolutionary because they suggested that perception involved computation. Your brain was running complex algorithms to make sense of sensory information. This meant that perception could potentially be hacked, fooled, or manipulated if you understood the underlying computational processes. It also meant that what we call reality was always mediated by these unconscious inferences, making direct access to the world impossible. The implications of this became clear through the study of optical illusions, those fascinating visual tricks that reveal the hidden assumptions and shortcuts your brain uses to construct your visual reality. Take the famous Mueller-Lyer illusion, where two identical lines appear to be different lengths, depending on whether they have arrowheads or tails attached to their ends. This isn't just a curious visual trick. It reveals something profound about how your brain processes spatial information. Your visual system automatically interprets the arrowheads and tails as depth cues, similar to the corners of rooms or buildings. One line appears to be the near corner of a room extending toward you, while the other appears to be a far corner receding away. Your brain adjusts the perceived length of the lines to account for what it believes is their distance from you. The fact that you continue to see this illusion, even when you know it's an illusion, is particularly revealing. Conscious knowledge cannot override the unconscious inference mechanisms that create your perceptual reality. This suggests that perception operates at a level below conscious awareness, using processes that evolved over millions of years and cannot be easily overruled by rational thought. But perhaps the most dramatic demonstrations of perceptual construction come from studies of people who have gained sight after being born blind. These cases, though rare, provide a unique window into how the visual system learns to make sense of the world. In 1963, neurobiologist David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel conducted groundbreaking experiments that showed how the visual cortex develops its ability to process different types of visual information. They found that if animals were deprived of normal visual input during critical periods of development, their visual systems would develop abnormally, sometimes permanently losing the ability to process certain types of visual patterns. This research revealed that perception isn't just about having functioning sense organs. It's about having a brain that has learned how to interpret the signals from those organs. A person who gains sight as an adult after being blind from birth doesn't immediately see the world the way a sighted person does. They must learn to interpret visual information, often struggling with tasks that seem effortless to those of us who developed vision normally. They might be able to detect light and dark, but unable to recognize faces, unable to judge distances, or unable to distinguish between a photograph and the real object it depicts. One of the most famous cases was that of Sidney Bradford, a 52-year-old man who gained sight for the first time in 1963 after a corneal transplant. Initially, Bradford was excited about his newfound vision, but he soon became deeply depressed. The visual world was confusing and often frightening. He could not judge distances, frequently bumping into objects. He had difficulty recognizing faces, even those of his loved ones. Most disturbing of all, the visual world often contradicted his other senses. Objects that felt smooth might look bumpy. Things that seemed one size when touched appeared to be a different size when seen. Bradford's case illustrates a crucial point. Perception is not just about receiving sensory information, but about having learned how to integrate and interpret that information in meaningful ways. Your brain spent years during childhood learning to calibrate your visual system with your other senses, building up associations between visual patterns and their meaning in the world. Without this learning process, raw visual information remains largely meaningless. This has profound implications for our understanding of reality. If perception requires learning, then what you perceive is necessarily shaped by your past experiences, cultural background, and the particular ways your brain happened to develop. Two people looking at the same scene are not just seeing the same thing filtered through different interpretations. They may literally be constructing different perceptual realities. Neuroscientist Anil Seth has described consciousness and perception as a kind of controlled hallucination. According to this view, your brain is constantly generating predictions about what it expects to encounter in the world, and it uses sensory information primarily to update and refine these predictions rather than to create a direct representation of external reality. You're not perceiving the world so much as you're hallucinating a world that's constrained by sensory input. This predictive processing model explains many otherwise puzzling aspects of perception. For example, why do you sometimes hear your name being called in a noisy environment, even when no one actually called you? Your brain, primed to detect this important signal, sometimes interprets ambiguous auditory information as your name being called. Why do you sometimes see faces in clouds, electrical outlets, or random patterns? Your brain has powerful face detection algorithms that sometimes trigger false positives, seeing faces where none exist. The predictive nature of perception also explains why context matters so much for what you perceive. The same sensory input can be interpreted completely differently depending on what your brain expects to encounter. In the famous sine wave speech experiments, people listen to acoustic signals that sound like random electronic beeps and whistles. But if they're first told that these sounds are actually degraded speech and given a written transcript to follow along, the beeps and whistles suddenly transform into clearly intelligible words. Once you hear them as speech, it becomes almost impossible to hear them as random sounds again. Your brain has updated its predictive model, and this changes your perceptual reality permanently. This contextual nature of perception has serious implications for eyewitness testimony in legal settings. When someone witnesses a crime, they're not simply recording what happened like a video camera. Instead, their brain is actively constructing an interpretation of events based on their expectations, past experiences, and emotional state. Details that weren't clearly perceived at the time can be filled in later by the brain's reconstruction processes, often influenced by subsequent information like police questions or news reports. Elizabeth Loftus, a pioneering researcher in the psychology of memory and perception, has conducted hundreds of studies showing how easily and dramatically eyewitness memories can be altered. In one famous study, participants watched videos of car accidents and were later asked questions about what they saw. Some participants were asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, while others were asked, how fast were the cars going when they contacted each other. The simple change in verb from contacted to smashed significantly influenced not only how fast participants estimated the cars were traveling, but also whether they remembered seeing broken glass at the scene. There wasn't any. Even more dramatically, Loftus showed that entirely false memories could be implanted through suggestion. In one study, she convinced participants that they had been lost in a shopping mall as a child, an event that never actually happened. Through repeated questioning and the power of suggestion, many participants not only came to believe this false memory was real, but began adding rich details about the experience. These findings reveal that memory and perception are far more malleable than we typically assume. Your brain doesn't store exact copies of past experiences. Instead, it stores fragments and associations that are reconstructed each time you remember something. This reconstruction process is influenced by your current knowledge, beliefs, and emotional state, meaning that remembering something literally changes the memory itself. The malleability of perception and memory becomes even more striking when we consider how they can be altered by brain damage or neurological conditions. Patients with certain types of brain damage can develop conditions that seem almost impossible to believe. Consider Anton's syndrome, where patients with damage to their visual cortex become blind, but insist that they can see perfectly well. When asked to describe what's in front of them, they'll confidently provide detailed descriptions that are completely wrong. They're not lying or in denial. They genuinely believe they can see. Their brain is filling in the missing visual information so completely that they're unaware of their blindness. Or consider patients with Capgras delusion who become convinced that their loved ones have been replaced by identical-looking imposters. They can recognize their family member's face and know all the relevant facts about their relationship, but the emotional connection that normally accompanies recognition is missing due to brain damage. The result is the eerie conviction that this person who looks and acts exactly like their spouse or parent must be an imposter, because they don't feel the expected emotional response. These conditions reveal just how much our normal perceptual experience depends on the seamless integration of multiple brain systems. When one component is damaged, the entire edifice of constructed reality can become dramatically altered, yet the person experiencing these changes often has no insight into their condition. This suggests that our confidence in our own perceptual abilities may be misplaced. We simply have no direct access to the processes that create our reality, making it impossible to know when those processes might be leading us astray. The study of psychoactive substances provides another window into the constructed nature of perception. Drugs like LSD, psilocybin, and DMT can dramatically alter perceptual experience, creating visions, hallucinations, and completely novel sensory experiences. What's particularly interesting is that these substances don't add new sensory information. Instead, they alter the brain's processing of existing information, revealing the extent to which normal perception depends on specific patterns of neural activity. Robin Carhart Harris, a leading researcher in the neuroscience of psychedelics, has proposed that these substances work primarily by reducing the brain's predictive processing, essentially turning down the volume on the brain's expectations and allowing raw sensory information to be processed in novel ways. This can lead to profound perceptual changes. Colors may seem more vivid, patterns may appear to move and breathe, and the boundaries between different senses may break down, leading to synesthesia-like experiences where sounds have colors or colors have textures. These altered states of consciousness raise fascinating questions about which version of reality is more true. If psychedelics can reveal aspects of perception normally hidden by the brain's predictive processing, are they providing access to a more direct experience of reality, or are they simply creating different types of illusions? The fact that many people report profound insights and lasting positive changes from psychedelic experiences suggests that these altered states might reveal something important about the constructed nature of ordinary consciousness. But you don't need drugs to experience the constructed nature of perception. Meditation traditions have long recognized that ordinary consciousness is characterized by constant mental construction and interpretation. Advanced meditators often report experiences where the normal sense of self and world dissolve, revealing what they describe as a more direct, unconstructed awareness. Whether these experiences represent genuine insights into the nature of reality or simply different types of altered states remains hotly debated. The constructed nature of perception becomes even more apparent when we consider how different species perceive the world. Your perceptual reality is shaped by the particular sensory organs you happen to evolve, but other animals live in radically different sensory worlds. Bees can see ultraviolet patterns on flowers that are completely invisible to you. Snakes can detect infrared radiation, essentially seeing heat. Dolphins and bats navigate using echolocation, creating detailed three-dimensional maps of their environment through sound. Elephants communicate using infrasonic calls below the range of human hearing, and sharks can detect electrical fields generated by other animals' nervous systems. Jakob von Uexküll, an Estonian biologist, coined the term Umwelt to describe the perceptual world inhabited by different organisms. Each species, he argued, lives in its own unique sensory universe, shaped by its particular sensory capabilities and needs. A tick's Umwelt consists primarily of three stimuli: butyric acid, indicating a potential host, warmth, and tactile sensations. This simple sensory world is perfectly suited to the tick's lifestyle, but it's radically different from the rich, multi-layered perceptual reality that humans experience. This raises a humbling question. If every species lives in its own unique Umwelt, what makes us think that the human version corresponds to objective reality? We tend to assume that our senses give us privileged access to the way things really are, but this assumption becomes harder to maintain when we recognize that our perceptual apparatus is just one possible way of sampling and interpreting information from the environment. Recent developments in neuroscience and artificial intelligence have begun to provide even more detailed insights into the mechanisms underlying perception. We now know that the brain processes different aspects of visual information in parallel streams, one stream focusing on object recognition, what, pathway, and another focusing on spatial relationships and movement, where, pathway. These streams can be independently damaged, leading to conditions where someone can recognize objects but not locate them in space, or vice versa. We also know that perception involves extensive feedback connections, with higher-level brain areas constantly sending predictions back to lower-level sensory areas. This means that what you perceive at any given moment is the result of a complex negotiation between bottom-up sensory information and top-down predictions and expectations. Your brain is essentially running a constant simulation of reality, using sensory input to update and refine its model rather than creating a direct representation of the external world. This has led some researchers to propose that consciousness itself might be best understood as a kind of user interface, a simplified, user-friendly representation of underlying reality designed to help you navigate the world effectively rather than to provide accurate information about what's actually out there. Just as the icons on your computer desktop don't literally represent the underlying electrical patterns in your computer's memory, your perceptual experience might be a useful fiction that bears only a loose relationship to the actual structure of reality. Cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman has taken this idea even further, arguing that evolution doesn't select for accurate perceptions, but for useful ones. If seeing the world accurately conflicted with survival and reproduction, evolution would favor the useful fiction over the accurate perception. According to Hoffman's interface theory of perception, our senses didn't evolve to show us reality. They evolved to help us navigate our environment and pass on our genes. The result is that we're fundamentally cut off from objective reality, trapped inside a species-specific interface that may bear little resemblance to the actual structure of the world. This might sound like an abstract philosophical speculation, but it has practical implications for how we think about knowledge, science, and truth. If our perceptions are fundamentally limited and potentially misleading, how can we ever hope to understand the nature of reality? Science has been remarkably successful at revealing aspects of the world that are invisible to direct perception, from the microscopic world of atoms and molecules to the vast scales of cosmology. But scientific instruments and theories are themselves products of human cognition, built using brains that evolved for very different purposes than understanding objective reality. Yet perhaps this limitation is also a source of hope. The very fact that we can recognize the constructed nature of perception suggests that we're not completely trapped within our sensory interfaces. Through careful observation, experimentation, and reasoning, we've been able to discover many of the illusions and biases that shape our perceptual reality. We've learned to distrust our intuitions in many domains and to rely instead on systematic methods that help us overcome our perceptual limitations. The recognition that perception is constructed also opens up new possibilities for enhancing and extending human sensory capabilities. Researchers are developing devices that can translate information from one sensory modality to another, allowing blind people to see through tactile or auditory feedback, or deaf people to hear through visual displays. These technologies work by taking advantage of the brain's remarkable plasticity, its ability to adapt and rewire itself based on new patterns of input. More exotic possibilities are also on the horizon. What if we could give humans the ability to directly perceive magnetic fields, like migratory birds, or infrared radiation, like snakes, or electrical fields, like sharks? Such sensory augmentations would fundamentally alter human umwelt, potentially revealing aspects of reality that are currently hidden from us. They would also raise profound questions about personal identity and what it means to be human. Virtual and augmented reality technologies are already beginning to blur the boundaries between perceived and constructed realities. These systems work by hijacking the same perceptual mechanisms that create your normal experience of reality, presenting artificial sensory information in ways that your brain interprets as real. As these technologies become more sophisticated, the distinction between natural and artificial perceptual experiences may become increasingly meaningless. But perhaps the most profound implications of understanding perception as construction relate to empathy and understanding others. If each person's reality is constructed through their unique brain, shaped by their particular experiences, genetics, and circumstances, then we must be humble about our ability to truly understand what others experience. The person sitting next to you isn't just interpreting the same reality differently. They may literally be living in a different perceptual world. This has implications for everything from education to mental health care to social justice. If someone with autism, depression, anxiety, or schizophrenia experiences reality differently at a fundamental perceptual level, then truly helping them requires trying to understand their unique constructed reality rather than assuming they're simply interpreting the same world incorrectly. The growing recognition that conditions like autism involve different ways of processing sensory information rather than deficits or impairments reflects this deeper understanding of perception as construction. The study of perception and its potential unreliability also sheds light on some of humanity's deepest questions about knowledge and reality. For centuries, philosophers have debated whether we can ever have certain knowledge about the external world. The discoveries of modern neuroscience suggest that this may be the wrong question to ask. Rather than asking whether our perceptions are accurate representations of reality, we might ask whether they're useful for helping us navigate our environment and achieve our goals. From this pragmatic perspective, the deception involved in perception isn't really deception at all. It's a sophisticated system for creating useful representations of reality. The blind spot in your vision isn't filled in to deceive you, it's filled in to maintain a coherent, navigable visual field. The brain's tendency to see faces in ambiguous patterns isn't a bug. It's a feature that helps you quickly identify other people, even in poor lighting or partially obscured conditions. Yet this pragmatic view raises its own questions. If our perceptions are shaped by evolutionary pressures that operated in ancestral environments very different from our modern world, are they still useful guides to reality? Our brains evolved to handle small groups of people in natural environments, but we now live in large, complex societies surrounded by artificial stimuli that our ancestors never encountered. Many of our cognitive biases and perceptual errors might reflect this mismatch between the environment we evolved for and the environment we now inhabit. Consider how easily our visual systems can be overwhelmed by the rapid cuts and flashy imagery of modern media, or how our attention can be captured and held by digital devices designed to exploit our brain's reward systems. These technologies work precisely because they understand and manipulate the constructed nature of our perceptual reality. Social media platforms use algorithms designed to trigger emotional responses and keep us engaged, often regardless of whether the information they present is accurate or beneficial. The recognition that perception is constructed also has implications for how we think about artificial intelligence. If human intelligence is based on constructed perceptual realities rather than direct access to objective truth, then perhaps artificial intelligence systems will also need to construct their own versions of reality rather than simply processing raw data. The most successful AI systems might be those that, like biological brains, create useful simplifications and abstractions rather than trying to represent everything with perfect accuracy. Current AI systems already demonstrate some of the same perceptual biases and limitations as human brains. Computer vision systems can be fooled by adversarial examples, images that look normal to humans but cause AI systems to make wildly incorrect classifications. These examples reveal that AI systems, like human brains, rely on learned patterns and associations that can sometimes lead them astray. As we develop more sophisticated AI systems, we'll need to grapple with questions about what kinds of perceptual realities we want them to construct. Should an AI system's representation of reality prioritize accuracy, usefulness, or something else entirely? How do we ensure that AI systems don't inherit and amplify the biases and limitations of human perception? The study of perception also raises profound questions about consciousness itself. If perception involves constructing reality rather than passively receiving it, then consciousness might be best understood as the subjective experience of this construction process. The hard problem of consciousness, explaining why there's subjective experience at all rather than just unconscious information processing, might be connected to the constructed nature of perception. Some researchers have proposed that consciousness emerges from the brain's need to create a unified, coherent model of reality from fragmented sensory information. The subjective experience of consciousness might be what it feels like from the inside to be a system that constructs its own reality. This would explain why consciousness seems so immediate and vivid. It's not just processing information about the world, it's literally creating the world as experienced. But this raises even deeper questions. If consciousness is the subjective experience of constructed reality, then what determines the particular way each individual constructs their reality? Why do you experience your particular version of constructed reality rather than someone else's? These questions push us towards some of the deepest mysteries in science and philosophy: the nature of personal identity, the relationship between mind and brain, and the possibility that consciousness might be more fundamental than we typically assume. Recent research in neuroscience has also revealed the extent to which different people's brains are wired differently, even in the absence of any obvious neurological conditions. Studies using brain imaging techniques have shown that there's enormous variability in how different people's brains are organized. The areas responsible for processing language, recognizing faces, or controlling movement can be located in quite different places in different individuals. This suggests that people may literally experience reality differently at a neurobiological level, not just as a matter of interpretation or belief. This variability extends to more subtle aspects of perception as well. People vary in their ability to detect different colors, smells, tastes, and sounds. Some people are super tasters who experience flavors much more intensely than average, while others have diminished taste sensitivity. Some people experience synesthesia, where different senses become linked. They might see colors when hearing music or taste flavors when looking at certain shapes. These variations remind us that there's no single, canonical way that human brains construct perceptual reality. Even more striking are the cultural differences in perception that anthropologists and psychologists have documented. People from different cultural backgrounds don't just interpret the same perceptual information differently. They can literally perceive different things when looking at the same stimuli. For example, people from cultures that emphasize individual achievement tend to focus more on focal objects in visual scenes, while people from cultures that emphasize social harmony tend to pay more attention to contextual information and relationships between objects. These cultural differences in perception appear to be learned rather than innate, suggesting that the basic processes of perceptual construction are shaped by experience throughout life. Children growing up in different environments literally learn to perceive the world differently, developing neural pathways that privilege certain types of information over others. This cultural shaping of perception has important implications for how we think about universal human nature. While all humans share the same basic perceptual machinery, the way that machinery develops and functions is significantly influenced by cultural and environmental factors. This means that some of what we take to be universal aspects of human experience might actually be culturally specific ways of constructing reality. Language appears to play a particularly important role in shaping perceptual construction. The words and concepts available in your language influence how you categorize and attend to different aspects of your experience. For example, Russian speakers, who have different basic color terms for light blue and dark blue, are faster at discriminating between these colors than English speakers. Similarly, speakers of languages that have elaborate spatial reference systems based on absolute directions, north, south, east, west, rather than relative directions, left, right, develop enhanced spatial memory and navigation abilities. These findings suggest that the reality you construct is partially determined by the conceptual tools your culture provides. This doesn't mean that language completely determines thought. People can certainly think about concepts for which they don't have words, but it does suggest that language influences the ease with which certain distinctions are made and maintained in conscious awareness. The role of attention in perceptual construction is another crucial factor that's often overlooked. At any given moment, your sensory organs are receiving vast amounts of information, but only a tiny fraction of this information ever reaches conscious awareness. The process of attention acts like a spotlight, illuminating certain aspects of the sensory input while leaving others in the shadows. What you pay attention to literally determines what you perceive. This selective nature of attention can be demonstrated through phenomena like inattentional blindness, where people fail to notice obvious stimuli when their attention is focused elsewhere. In the famous invisible gorilla experiment, participants watching a video of people passing basketballs often fail to notice a person in a gorilla costume walking through the scene. The gorilla is clearly visible, but because participants' attention is focused on counting ball passes, it doesn't enter their constructed reality. These attentional effects reveal another way in which perception is far from passive. You're not just receiving sensory information, you're actively selecting which information to process and include in your constructed reality. This selection process is influenced by your goals, expectations, emotional state, and learned patterns of attention. Two people in the same environment can construct quite different perceptual realities simply by attending to different aspects of the available information. The recognition that attention shapes perception has practical applications for education, therapy, and personal development. Mindfulness practices, which train people to deliberately direct their attention in specific ways, can literally change what people perceive and experience. By learning to attend more carefully to present-moment sensory information and less to internal mental chatter, people can alter their constructed reality in beneficial ways. Recent developments in neurotechnology are also beginning to provide new ways to study and potentially manipulate the construction of perceptual reality. Techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation can temporarily alter the activity in specific brain regions, allowing researchers to test how different neural circuits contribute to perceptual construction. Brain-computer interfaces are being developed that could potentially allow direct control over some aspects of perceptual experience. These technologies raise fascinating possibilities and concerns. If we can manipulate the neural processes that construct perception, we might be able to enhance human perceptual capabilities or treat perceptual disorders in new ways, but we might also create new forms of manipulation and control. If perception is constructed, then whoever controls the construction process has enormous power over someone's experience of reality. The implications extend to how we think about truth and knowledge in the digital age. If human perception is fundamentally constructed and malleable, then technologies that can influence this construction process, from virtual reality to social media algorithms to targeted advertising, have the potential to shape people's realities in profound ways. The line between informing and manipulating becomes blurred when we recognize that all information processing involves construction and interpretation. This brings us to one of the most challenging aspects of understanding perception as construction. If everyone's reality is constructed, how do we maintain any shared basis for communication and cooperation? If you and I are literally living in different constructed realities, how can we ever truly understand each other or agree about anything? Part of the answer lies in recognizing that while individual perceptual constructions vary, they're not completely arbitrary. They're constrained by shared biology, common environments, and overlapping cultural experiences. Most humans share enough similarity in their perceptual construction processes to enable communication and cooperation, even if the details of their constructed realities differ. Another part of the answer involves developing better methods for understanding and accommodating different perceptual realities. Science itself can be seen as a collective method for overcoming individual perceptual limitations by establishing shared standards for observation and evidence. By explicitly recognizing the constructed nature of individual perception, we can work together to build more robust and accurate models of reality. But perhaps most importantly, understanding perception as construction can cultivate humility and empathy. If you recognize that your own perceptual reality is constructed rather than directly given, you might be more open to the possibility that others construct their realities differently. This doesn't lead to complete relativism. Some constructed realities are more useful, accurate, or beneficial than others. But it does suggest that disagreements about reality often reflect different construction processes rather than simple mistakes or bad faith. As we look toward the future, several developments are likely to further challenge our understanding of perception and reality. Advances in neuroscience will continue to reveal the detailed mechanisms by which brains construct perceptual realities. This knowledge might enable new forms of therapeutic intervention for conditions involving perceptual disturbances, from schizophrenia to depression to autism spectrum disorders. Developments in artificial intelligence and robotics will force us to think more carefully about what kinds of perceptual realities we want artificial systems to construct. As AI systems become more sophisticated and autonomous, questions about their perceptual capabilities and biases will become increasingly important. Virtual and augmented reality technologies will continue to blur the boundaries between natural and artificial perceptual experiences. As these systems become more convincing and ubiquitous, we may need to develop new frameworks for thinking about authenticity and truth in perceptual experience. Climate change and other global challenges will require forms of collective action that depend on shared understanding of reality. The recognition that perception is constructed makes these challenges both more difficult, because people may literally perceive different realities, and more hopeful, because it suggests that perceptual realities can be changed through education, experience, and deliberate effort. Perhaps most intriguingly, our growing understanding of perception as construction might enable new forms of human enhancement and self-modification. If perception is malleable, then perhaps people could learn to construct their realities in more beneficial ways. Practices like meditation, biofeedback, and perceptual training might become tools for consciously shaping the construction process. This brings us full circle to the question we started with: can we trust our senses? The answer, as we've seen, is both yes and no. We can't trust our senses to provide direct, unmediated access to objective reality. They're constantly constructing a useful fiction rather than recording truth. But we can trust our senses to provide us with constructed realities that are generally useful for navigating our environment and achieving our goals. The key insight is recognizing that perception is a tool rather than a window. Like any tool, it has capabilities and limitations, and it can be used skillfully or unskillfully. Understanding how perception works, how it constructs rather than simply receives reality, allows us to use this tool more effectively while remaining aware of its limitations. This understanding has profound implications for how we approach some of the most pressing questions of our time. Consider the challenge of fake news and misinformation in the digital age. When we recognize that all perception involves construction and interpretation, we realize that the problem isn't simply that some people are receiving false information while others are receiving true information. Instead, different people are constructing different realities from the available information, and these construction processes can be influenced by their prior beliefs, emotional states, and the particular algorithms that determine what information they encounter. Addressing misinformation requires understanding these construction processes rather than simply fact-checking individual claims. It requires recognizing that two people can look at the same evidence and construct entirely different interpretations of what it means. This doesn't lead to relativism. Some interpretations are better supported by evidence than others, but it does suggest that changing people's constructed realities requires more than just presenting them with correct facts. The constructed nature of perception also sheds light on the nature of expertise and learning. Experts in any field don't just know more facts than novices. They've learned to perceive their domain differently. A radiologist looking at an X-ray, a musician listening to a symphony, or a wine expert tasting a vintage are all constructing perceptual realities that are invisible to untrained observers. Years of training have literally rewired their brains to detect patterns, relationships, and subtleties that others cannot perceive. This suggests that education involves more than just transmitting information. It involves training people to construct different perceptual realities. Learning to read involves training the visual system to recognize letter patterns and automatically convert them into sounds and meanings. Learning mathematics involves developing the ability to perceive abstract relationships and patterns. Learning science involves developing new ways of attending to and interpreting natural phenomena. From this perspective, the goal of education isn't just to fill students' minds with facts, but to help them develop more sophisticated and useful ways of constructing reality. This might involve training attention, developing new conceptual frameworks, or practicing the deliberate suspension of judgment that allows alternative perspectives to be considered. The recognition that perception is constructed also has implications for how we think about mental health and psychological well-being. Many psychological disorders involve alterations in how people construct their perceptual reality. Depression often involves a systematic bias toward perceiving negative aspects of experience while filtering out positive information. Anxiety can involve hypervigilance to potential threats, creating a constructed reality dominated by danger and uncertainty. Post-traumatic stress disorder can involve intrusive re-experiencing of past events, where traumatic memories intrude into present-moment perception. Understanding these conditions as alterations in perceptual construction suggests that treatment might involve helping people learn to construct their realities differently. Cognitive behavioral therapy works partly by helping people recognize and change the thought patterns that influence their perceptual construction. Mindfulness-based therapies train people to observe their construction processes more objectively, creating space between themselves and their automatic patterns of perception and interpretation. But perhaps the most profound implications of understanding perception as construction relate to our sense of self and personal identity. If your perceptual reality is constructed by your brain, then what you think of as yourself is also, in large part, a construction. The sense of being a unified, continuous self persisting through time is created by the same constructive processes that create your perception of the external world. This constructed sense of self is remarkably robust under normal circumstances, but it can be altered by brain damage, psychological conditions, or psychoactive substances. People with certain types of brain injuries can lose the sense of ownership over their own body parts, or develop the conviction that they're actually someone else entirely. Meditation practitioners sometimes report experiences where the normal sense of self temporarily dissolves, revealing what they describe as a more fundamental awareness that exists prior to the construction of personal identity. These experiences suggest that the self, like perception generally, might be better understood as a useful fiction rather than a fundamental reality. This doesn't mean that the self is unimportant or illusory in a dismissive sense, but rather that it's a construction that serves important functions for navigation, social interaction, and goal pursuit. The constructed nature of the self also helps explain why personal identity can feel both absolutely certain and strangely elusive. From the inside, being yourself feels like the most obvious and undeniable fact about your existence. Yet when you try to pin down exactly what this self consists of, your thoughts, your memories, your body, your personality, each component turns out to be constantly changing and contextually dependent. Understanding the self as construction doesn't diminish its importance, but it does suggest that personal identity is more flexible and malleable than we typically assume. This has implications for personal growth, therapy, and how we think about human potential. If the self is constructed, then it can potentially be reconstructed in more beneficial ways. This brings us to one of the most exciting frontiers in the study of perception and consciousness: the possibility of deliberately modifying our construction processes to enhance human capabilities and well-being. Throughout history, humans have developed techniques for altering consciousness and perception, from meditation and prayer to music and dance to various forms of ritual and ceremony. These practices work by temporarily or permanently changing how the brain constructs perceptual reality. Modern neuroscience is beginning to understand the mechanisms underlying these practices, opening up possibilities for more targeted and effective interventions. For example, research on meditation has shown that regular practice can lead to measurable changes in brain structure and function, including increased thickness in areas associated with attention and emotional regulation. These changes correspond to alterations in how practitioners construct their moment-to-moment experience, generally in directions associated with greater well-being and mental clarity. Similarly, research on psychedelic substances has revealed their potential for creating lasting positive changes in how people construct their reality. Carefully administered psychedelic experiences can help people break out of rigid patterns of perception and cognition, allowing new ways of experiencing themselves and their relationships to emerge. The therapeutic potential of these substances for treating conditions like depression, PTSD, and addiction appears to work partly by disrupting maladaptive patterns of perceptual construction and allowing new, healthier patterns to emerge. But we don't need exotic practices or substances to work with the constructed nature of perception. Simple changes in attention, environment, or behavior can significantly alter constructed reality. The practice of gratitude, for example, works by training attention to focus on positive aspects of experience that might otherwise be overlooked. Regular exercise changes both brain chemistry and sensory experience in ways that can significantly alter mood and perception. Even changes in posture or breathing can influence how reality is constructed in subtle but meaningful ways. The recognition that perception is constructed also has implications for how we design environments and technologies. If human perception involves active construction rather than passive reception, then the environments we create will inevitably influence how people construct their realities. Urban planners, architects, and designers are beginning to incorporate insights from neuroscience and psychology to create spaces that promote well-being and positive perceptual experiences. Similarly, technology designers are starting to consider how their products influence the construction of reality. Social media platforms, video games, and virtual reality systems all work by hijacking or augmenting natural perceptual processes. Understanding these processes better allows for more responsible design that enhances rather than degrades human well-being. The constructed nature of perception also raises important questions about the future of human enhancement and modification. As our understanding of the brain improves, it may become possible to more directly alter the processes that construct perceptual reality. Brain-computer interfaces might allow people to directly experience new types of sensory information or to enhance existing sensory capabilities. Genetic modifications might allow future humans to perceive aspects of reality that are currently invisible to us. These possibilities are both exciting and concerning. Enhanced perceptual capabilities could allow humans to better understand and navigate an increasingly complex world. But they also raise questions about equality, authenticity, and what it means to be human. If some people have access to enhanced perceptual capabilities while others don't, this could create new forms of inequality and social stratification. More fundamentally, if we can deliberately modify how we construct reality, how do we decide what kinds of modifications are desirable? This question requires us to think carefully about human values and what kinds of experiences we want to promote. It also requires humility about our current understanding of consciousness and perception. We're still far from fully understanding these processes, making it difficult to predict the consequences of modifying them. As we grapple with these questions, it's worth remembering that the constructed nature of perception isn't a recent discovery or a problem to be solved. It's a fundamental feature of how conscious beings like ourselves relate to the world. Every organism that has ever existed has constructed its own version of reality based on its particular sensory capabilities and neural architecture. What's new is our growing understanding of these processes and our increasing ability to influence them deliberately. This understanding brings both opportunities and responsibilities. The opportunity lies in the possibility of constructing realities that better serve human flourishing and well-being. The responsibility lies in using this knowledge wisely, with careful attention to the consequences for individuals and society. Perhaps the most important lesson from the study of perception and its potential unreliability is the value of intellectual humility. If your perceptual reality is constructed rather than directly given, then you must always remain open to the possibility that your construction is incomplete, biased, or mistaken. This doesn't lead to paralysis or extreme skepticism, but it does suggest the value of seeking multiple perspectives, questioning assumptions, and remaining curious about alternative ways of constructing reality. This humility extends to how we think about consciousness itself. Despite remarkable advances in neuroscience and psychology, we're still far from fully understanding how subjective experience arises from neural activity. The hard problem of consciousness, explaining why there's subjective experience at all rather than just unconscious information processing, remains largely unsolved. The constructed nature of perception adds another layer to this mystery. Not only do we need to explain why there's subjective experience, but we need to explain why it takes the particular form of a unified, coherent perceptual reality. Some researchers have proposed that consciousness might be more fundamental than we typically assume, not something that emerges from complex neural activity, but something that neural activity shapes and modifies. According to this view, consciousness might be a basic feature of reality, like mass or electric charge, and brains might be devices for organizing and focusing consciousness rather than creating it from scratch. This perspective, known as panpsychism, is controversial and difficult to test scientifically, but it offers an interesting way of thinking about the relationship between consciousness and the constructed nature of perception. If consciousness is fundamental, then perhaps the construction of perceptual reality is how consciousness manifests itself through particular physical systems like brains. Whether or not consciousness turns out to be fundamental, the study of perception has revealed something profound about the nature of subjective experience. What you experience as reality is not a passive reflection of an external world, but an active, creative process that depends on the particular way your brain is organized and the specific patterns of activity it generates. This means that in a very real sense, you are continuously creating your own reality. This creative aspect of perception connects to broader questions about human agency and responsibility. If you're partly responsible for constructing your own reality, then you bear some responsibility for the kind of reality you construct. This doesn't mean blaming people for psychological conditions or difficult circumstances beyond their control, but it does suggest that we all have some capacity to influence our constructed reality through our choices about attention, interpretation, and response. The recognition that perception involves construction also connects to questions about meaning and purpose in life. If reality is constructed rather than simply given, then the meaning you find in life is partly something you create rather than something you discover. This can be either liberating or terrifying, depending on your perspective. It means that you have more agency in determining the quality and character of your experience than you might have realized. But it also means that you can't rely on external reality to provide predetermined meaning and purpose. This brings us back to the practical question of how to live wisely in light of what we know about perception and its potential unreliability. One approach is to develop what we might call perceptual wisdom, the ability to work skillfully with the constructed nature of your own experience. This involves several interconnected capabilities. First, Perceptual wisdom involves developing greater awareness of your own construction processes. This means noticing when your perceptions are being influenced by expectations, emotions, or assumptions rather than just sensory information. It means recognizing the difference between what you directly perceive and what you infer or assume. Mindfulness practices can be helpful for developing this kind of awareness, but so can careful attention to your own thought processes and reactions. Second, perceptual wisdom involves developing flexibility in how you construct reality. This means being willing to consider alternative interpretations of your experience and being open to feedback that might suggest your construction is incomplete or biased. It means cultivating curiosity about perspectives that differ from your own and being willing to temporarily suspend your usual ways of perceiving in order to explore new possibilities. Third, perceptual wisdom involves understanding the relationship between your constructed reality and your well-being. Some ways of constructing reality promote flourishing and positive relationships, while others lead to suffering and conflict. Learning to distinguish between helpful and unhelpful construction patterns is a crucial life skill that can be developed through experience, reflection, and sometimes professional guidance. Fourth, perceptual wisdom involves appreciating both the limitations and the remarkable capabilities of human perception. Yes, your senses can be fooled, your memories can be altered, and your interpretations can be biased. But the same constructive processes that create these vulnerabilities also enable incredible feats of creativity, learning, and adaptation. Human perception is not just about receiving information, it's about creating meaning, beauty, and understanding. This appreciation for both the limitations and capabilities of perception leads to a balanced approach to the question of trust. You can't trust your senses to provide direct access to objective reality, but you can trust them to provide you with a constructed reality that's generally useful for navigating your environment and pursuing your goals. The key is understanding how this construction process works and learning to work with it skillfully. This balanced approach also applies to how we think about science and other methods for understanding reality. Science doesn't give us direct access to objective truth any more than ordinary perception does. It's another way of constructing reality, albeit one that uses systematic methods to reduce bias and increase reliability. The value of science lies not in its ability to transcend the constructed nature of all knowledge, but in its ability to create more robust and useful constructions through careful observation, experimentation, and peer review. Similarly, art, literature, and other forms of creative expression can be understood as explorations of different ways of constructing reality. Great artists don't just represent the world as it is, they help us see it in new ways, expanding our repertoire of possible constructions. The value of artistic expression lies partly in its ability to reveal the constructed nature of ordinary perception and to suggest alternative ways of experiencing and interpreting reality. As we conclude this exploration of perception and its relationship to reality, it's worth reflecting on what this understanding means for how we relate to others and navigate our shared world. If everyone is constructing their own version of reality, then disagreement and conflict are inevitable. But understanding the constructed nature of perception can also promote empathy and tolerance. When you disagree with someone, you can ask not just who is right, but what different construction processes might be leading to different conclusions. This doesn't mean that all perspectives are equally valid. Some constructions are more accurate, useful, or beneficial than others. But it does suggest that understanding others requires trying to understand how they construct their reality, not just what conclusions they reach. This kind of understanding can lead to more productive dialogue and more creative solutions to shared problems. The constructed nature of perception also highlights the importance of diversity in human societies. If different people construct reality differently based on their backgrounds, experiences, and neural configurations, then diversity of perspective is not just politically valuable, it's epistemologically valuable. A diverse group of people is likely to construct a more complete and accurate understanding of complex situations than a homogeneous group, because they'll notice different aspects of the available information and consider different interpretations. This suggests that some of our current social and political challenges might be better addressed by bringing together people with different ways of constructing reality rather than by trying to eliminate disagreement or enforce uniformity. The goal wouldn't be to reach a single, agreed-upon construction of reality, but to develop more comprehensive and nuanced understandings that integrate insights from multiple perspectives. Looking toward the future, our growing understanding of perception and consciousness is likely to continue raising new questions and possibilities. As we develop more sophisticated brain imaging techniques, we may gain unprecedented insights into the neural processes that construct perceptual reality. This could lead to new treatments for perceptual disorders, new methods for enhancing human capabilities, and new understanding of consciousness itself. At the same time, advances in artificial intelligence and virtual reality will continue to blur the boundaries between natural and artificial perception. We may need to develop new frameworks for thinking about authenticity, reality, and truth in a world where constructed experiences can be shared, modified, and artificially generated. Perhaps most importantly, our understanding of perception as construction will continue to inform how we think about human nature and human potential. If the reality you experience is constructed rather than simply given, then human consciousness is revealed to be far more creative, flexible, and powerful than commonly assumed. This doesn't make you omnipotent. Your constructions are constrained by biology, physics, and social reality. But it does suggest that you have more agency in determining the quality and character of your experience than you might have realized. This agency brings both opportunity and responsibility. The opportunity lies in the possibility of constructing realities that better serve human flourishing, creativity, and understanding. The responsibility lies in using this capacity wisely, with attention to the consequences for yourself and others. So, can we trust our senses? The answer is nuanced. We can trust them to do what they evolved to do, construct useful representations of reality that help us navigate our environment and achieve our goals. We cannot trust them to provide direct, unmediated access to objective truth. But perhaps this limitation is also a gift. The constructed nature of perception is what makes human experience rich, meaningful, and infinitely creative. It's what allows us to find beauty in a sunset, meaning in a story, and hope in the face of uncertainty. In the end, the question isn't whether we can trust our senses, but whether we can learn to work skillfully with the remarkable, complex, and creative process of perceptual construction that makes human consciousness possible. This work, the work of understanding how we create our reality and learning to create it more wisely, may be one of the most important challenges and opportunities of our time. The journey into the nature of perception reveals that reality, as we experience it, is far stranger and more wonderful than common sense suggests. We live not in a world of fixed, objective facts, but in a universe of constructed meanings, where consciousness and reality dance together in an intricate, ongoing choreography. Understanding this dance doesn't diminish the wonder of existence. It reveals consciousness itself as perhaps the most remarkable phenomenon in the known universe. In recognizing that our senses both reveal and conceal, that our perceptions both connect us to reality and separate us from it, we find ourselves in a position of profound responsibility and extraordinary possibility. We are not passive observers of a predetermined reality, but active participants in its ongoing creation. The question that remains is not whether we can trust our senses, but whether we can learn to use the incredible gift of consciousness wisely, compassionately, and creatively. The story of perception is ultimately the story of consciousness itself, how it arises, how it creates meaning from chaos, and how it might continue to evolve and develop. In understanding our perceptual limitations, we paradoxically discover our greatest strength, the ability to know that we construct reality, and in knowing this, to take responsibility for the reality we choose to construct. This may be the most profound insight of all, that in questioning the reliability of our senses, we discover the remarkable reliability of our capacity to question, to wonder, and to grow in understanding. As you navigate your own constructed reality, remember that you are both the author and the character in the story of your experience. The pen is in your hands, the story is still being written, and the possibilities for what comes next are limited only by your imagination, your wisdom, and your willingness to embrace the beautiful uncertainty of conscious existence.